Rain hit Nora Bennett's face like small stones as she ran through the black trees, her bare feet tearing on roots she could not see. Behind her, the shouts of the pack guards grew louder, closer, hungry. She had broken a rule that Omegas were never allowed to break. She had refused to hand her healing herbs to the pack alpha's son, Colin Marsh, who wanted to sell them for his own profit instead of using them to save a sick child in the lower village. For that small act of defiance, 3 grown wolves had been sent to drag her back and make an example of her. Her lungs burned. Thunder cracked above the forest, so loud it shook water from the leaves. She did not know these woods. She only knew that if she stopped running, she would be caught, and if she was caught, she would not be given mercy. Nora pressed a hand against a tree to steady herself and looked back. Torches flickered between the trunks, bobbing like hungry eyes. She turned and ran again, deeper into land she had never dared enter before, land that every wolf in her pack had warned her never to cross. This was royal ground. This belonged to the Alpha King himself, a place guarded so fiercely that trespassers were said to vanish and never be seen again. But a punishment that was only a rumor felt safer tonight than the guards who were very real and very close behind her. The ground changed beneath her feet. It grew soft, then wet. Then it pulled at her ankles like something alive. She had stumbled into a wide stretch of mud at the bottom of a shallow valley, the storm turning the earth into a thick, dark soup. She almost turned back. Then she heard a sound that froze her blood colder than the rain ever could. A roar. Not the bark or the howl of an ordinary wolf, but something deeper, wilder, filled with pain and fury all twisted together. It came from somewhere close, somewhere in the mud itself, and it was the kind of sound that made every instinct in her body scream to run the other way. Nora did not run. She could not explain later why she stayed. Perhaps it was because the guards were closer now, and there was nowhere left to run to. Perhaps it was something else entirely, something she did not yet have words for. She crept forward instead, staying low, until the shape of the thing making that terrible sound came into view through the sheets of rain. It was a wolf, but no wolf she had ever seen. It was massive, larger than any beast in her pack, its fur matted black with mud and streaked with something darker that could only be blood. It thrashed in the wide pit of mud, as if fighting an enemy that was not there, snapping its jaws at the empty air, its eyes wild and unseeing. One of its front legs dragged strangely, wounded. Steam rose off its heaving sides into the cold rain. This was not an animal caught in a trap. This was a creature caught inside its own mind, lost somewhere dark and unreachable, drowning in a storm that had nothing to do with the weather. Nora had seen wolves lose control before, when grief or fury became too heavy to carry, when the wolf inside took over completely, and the man or woman inside disappeared. She had seen it happen to an old healer in her village once, after his mate died. It had taken 6 warriors to hold him down. There would be no 6 warriors here to help this creature. There was only her. Every part of her body told her to turn and slip back into the trees, to let the guards find her, rather than face what thrashed in front of her. A beast like this could tear her apart with a single bite, and never even remember doing it. But something in the sound it made was not only rage. Underneath the fury, she heard something smaller and more broken. She heard pain that had nowhere left to go. Nora had spent her whole life learning how to calm frightened, hurting things. She had done it for injured animals brought to her by village children. She had done it for the old healer when his wolf finally began to quiet, sitting beside him for 3 days and 3 nights, until his eyes came back to him. She did not know if the same gentleness could reach a creature this large, this far gone, but she also knew that the alternative was to stand in the rain and watch something suffer without trying to help. She stepped into the mud. It swallowed her ankles, then her calves, cold and heavy, pulling at her with every step. The great wolf's head snapped toward her the moment it sensed movement, and its eyes, wide and rolling with a kind of madness, locked onto her. A low growl rolled out of its chest, a warning, the last thread of a mind that still understood danger. Nora stopped where she was, half sunk in the mud, and lowered herself slowly, carefully, until she was almost level with the beast's massive head. She kept her hands open at her sides, empty, showing she carried nothing that could hurt him. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said, her voice barely rising above the rain. "I know you're in pain. I know something happened to you. But you don't have to fight anymore. Not right now. Not with me." The wolf's growl deepened. Its lips pulled back over teeth long enough to end her life in a single motion. Somewhere behind her, faint through the storm, she heard the guards' voices calling to each other, searching, still far enough away that they had not yet found the valley. She had only moments before either the beast or the men behind her decided her fate. She kept talking. She did not know if the beast understood words the way a man would, but she had learned long ago that tone mattered more than meaning to a frightened animal. She kept her voice low and even, the same voice she used for wounded birds and orphaned pups. The same voice that had once talked a dying old wolf back from the edge of losing himself completely. "You're hurting," she said again. "I can see it. Whatever happened to you, whatever this pain is, it doesn't have to win tonight." The great wolf's chest heaved, its wounded leg trembled beneath it, unable to hold its weight properly, and for a moment, the fury in its eyes flickered, replaced by something closer to exhaustion. Nora inched closer through the mud, close enough now that she could feel the heat rolling off the beast's massive body despite the cold rain. Lightning cracked across the sky, and in that white flash of light, she saw the true size of him clearly for the first time, and her stomach dropped with fear. He was easily 3 times the size of any wolf she had known. His shoulders alone were as tall as her chest. If he decided in this instant to end her, there would be nothing she could do to stop him. She reached out anyway. Her fingers touched the thick, matted fur at the side of his massive neck. The beast went rigid beneath her hand, every muscle coiled, and for one terrible heartbeat she was certain this was the moment he would turn and take her life. Instead, something in him seemed to shift. The rigid muscle beneath her palm, slowly began to loosen. The growl in his throat faded into something quieter, something almost like a whimper, small and lost inside such a huge and terrible body. "That's it," she whispered, keeping her hand steady against his fur even as her own hand shook with fear. "That's it. You're not alone out here. I've got you." The wild look in his eyes began to clear, like fog burning away under morning sun. His breathing slowed. The trembling in his wounded leg eased as he shifted his weight more evenly, no longer thrashing, no longer fighting an enemy that existed only in his shattered mind. Nora kept talking softly, kept her hand moving in slow, gentle strokes along his neck and shoulder, feeling the mud and blood cling to her fingers, not caring at all. Then, in a motion so unexpected that she nearly fell backward into the mud, the enormous wolf lowered his massive head until it rested against her knees, his eyes closing, a long, shuddering breath leaving his body. It was not the posture of a predator anymore. It was the posture of complete surrender, of something ancient and proud, bowing before something it recognized as safe. Nora sat frozen for a moment, her heart hammering, hardly able to believe what had just happened. She had heard stories, whispered ones, about how the wildest and most dangerous wolves sometimes bowed only to the one person meant for them, a bond older than pack law, older than kingdoms. She had never believed the stories were real. She still was not sure she believed it now, but the proof of it rested heavy and warm against her knees in the freezing mud. She noticed the wound then, a deep gash along his front leg, still bleeding despite the rain washing over it. Without thinking too hard about what she was doing, she tore a strip of cloth from the hem of her already ruined dress and began to bind the wound as gently as she could, murmuring softly the whole time, the way she always did for frightened creatures who did not yet trust that help would not also bring pain. The great wolf did not flinch away from her touch again. He let her work, his golden eyes half open, watching her with an intensity that made her chest feel strangely tight, though she could not have explained why. There was something in his gaze that felt less like an animal watching a stranger, and more like someone looking at another person for the very first time, and recognizing them completely. As she finished tying the bandage, the storm around them seemed to soften, the thunder rolling farther away, the rain easing into a gentle patter against the mud. The wolf's massive body began to shudder, and Nora realized with a start that he was shifting, the fur retreating, the shape of him folding inward and changing before her eyes. She had seen shifting before, from wolf to human and back, but never like this, never so raw and unguarded. Where the wild beast had lain moments before, there now knelt a man, tall and broad, even collapsed in exhaustion, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his bare chest rising and falling with ragged breath. Mud and rain covered him from head to foot. and a fresh line of dried blood ran along the same arm where the wound had been on his wolf form. His eyes opened, and they were the same eyes that had stared at her from the wolf's face only moments before, golden and searching, though now they held the clarity of a man returning to himself after being lost somewhere terrible. He looked at her as if trying to understand how she had found him, how she had reached him when nothing else could. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The rain fell softly around them, the storm's fury spent, and somewhere in the distance the guards' voices had gone quiet, either given up or moved on to search elsewhere. Nora realized she was still kneeling in the mud beside a stranger who moments ago had been a beast large enough to end her life with a single bite, and yet she felt no fear at all, only a strange, quiet steadiness she could not name. "Who are you?" the man finally asked, his voice rough, as if he had not used it in a very long time, though only hours could have passed since whatever had driven him into that state of madness. Nora hesitated. She thought of the guards searching for her, of the trouble that would follow if her name reached the wrong ears in this territory. She thought of how strange this entire night had already become, and how much stranger it might grow if she gave a stranger the truth. "It doesn't matter who I am," she said softly instead. "What matters is that you're safe now. You should rest. Whatever happened to you tonight, it's over." The man studied her for a long moment, mud streaked across his face, blood drying on his arm, and something unreadable moving behind his golden eyes. He did not press her for her name again, though she could see in his expression that he wanted to. Instead, he let his eyes close, his body finally giving in to the exhaustion that had been chasing him since before she ever found him in that pit of mud. Nora stayed beside him, until his breathing evened into something like sleep, and only then did she rise unsteadily to her feet, mud dripping from her ruined dress, her hands trembling now that the danger had passed, and there was nothing left to focus on but the strangeness of what she had just done. She looked down at the sleeping stranger one last time, memorizing the shape of his face without quite meaning to, and then she turned and slipped back into the trees, disappearing into the last of the storm, before anyone could find either of them there in that valley of mud, where something ancient and unspoken had just quietly begun. She did not know his name. She did not know he was the Alpha King of the entire kingdom she had been born into. She only knew that something in her chest had shifted tonight, something she would not be able to explain to herself or to anyone else, and that she would carry the memory of his golden eyes with her, long after the mud had washed from her skin. Ronan Ashwood woke to the pale light of early morning, his body aching in ways he had not felt in years, his mind slowly piecing together fragments of a night he could barely remember. He was no longer in the mud. He lay instead on a cot inside a hunting shelter deep within his own territory, a blanket thrown over him, his wound cleaned and freshly bandaged with cloth that was not his own. He sat up too quickly, pain lancing through his arm, and pressed a hand against his forehead as the memories began to return in broken pieces. The fury, the poison that had been slipped into his wine during the council dinner 2 nights before. A poison meant to weaken him, but that had instead torn his control apart and released the wolf inside him with no restraint at all. He remembered running, remembered the world turning red and formless, remembered pain and rage with no shape and no end. And then, cutting through all of it like a single ray of light through a storm, he remembered her. He remembered a voice, soft and steady, speaking to him, as if he were not a monster but something worth saving. He remembered hands, small and gentle, touching fur matted with mud and blood, without hesitation or fear. He remembered lowering his head, an act he had not chosen with his mind, but with something far older and far more powerful, something buried so deep inside him that he had not known it still existed. His beast had bowed, not out of weakness, not out of defeat, but out of recognition. Every wolf shifter knew the old stories, the ones told to children and half believed by adults, about the bond that could calm even the wildest and most broken creature, the bond that marked a true mate. Ronan had never believed those stories applied to him. He was the Alpha King, born of a bloodline meant to rule through strength and control, and every advisor he had ever known insisted that his mate, when chosen, would come from noble blood and careful arrangement, not from chance encounters in the mud during the worst night of his life. And yet his beast had bowed to a stranger, whose name he did not even know. He rose from the cot slowly, testing his weight on legs that still felt unsteady, and made his way to the shelter's narrow window. Outside, the storm had cleared completely, leaving the forest washed clean and glittering under morning light. Somewhere out there, a woman with gentle hands and a steady voice was walking free, unaware that she had calmed a king, unaware that something inside him now refused to settle unless she was near. He needed to find her, not out of duty, not out of curiosity alone, but because something primal inside his chest had already decided she mattered, and no amount of reasoning from the rational part of his mind seemed able to argue that instinct away. By the time Ronan returned to the palace, dressed in fresh clothing that hid the last traces of the mud and blood from the night before, the halls were already buzzing with quiet, careful whispers. His personal guard, Edmund Hale, met him at the private entrance with a face carved from worry. "Your Majesty," Edmund said, keeping his voice low as they walked together through a corridor meant only for the king's most trusted staff. "We searched through most of the night. Whatever affected you seems to have passed, but the council will want answers. There are already rumors that your control slipped. Let them whisper," Ronan said, though the words came out sharper than he intended. He softened his tone, aware that Edmund had served his family faithfully for 2 decades and did not deserve his frustration. "I need you to find someone for me, a woman. She would have been near the valley, south of the hunting grounds last night, likely soaked through from the storm, likely from one of the lower packs, given how far she must have traveled to end up there." Edmund's brow furrowed. "Do you have a name, Your Majesty?" "No," Ronan admitted, and the word felt strange leaving his mouth, an admission of ignorance he was not accustomed to giving. "I don't have a name. I don't have very much at all. Only that she was there, and that I need to know she is safe." Edmund studied him for a long moment, the kind of look that came only from a man who had known someone since childhood, and could read the things left unsaid beneath careful words. "This is about last night," he said quietly. It was not a question. Ronan did not answer directly, which was answer enough. "Find her quietly," he said instead. "I don't want this reaching the council before I understand what it means myself." Edmund nodded slowly, though concern still lingered in his expression. "I'll do what I can, Your Majesty. But territory this size, with no name and only a rough description, it may take time." "Then it takes time," Ronan said, though impatience already gnawed at him, an unfamiliar and uncomfortable sensation for a man used to having his orders carried out immediately and completely. He spent the rest of the morning attending to matters he could barely focus on, his mind circling constantly back to golden hands moving gently through matted fur, to a voice that had reached him when nothing else could. By midday, he found himself standing at the window of his private study, staring out over the kingdom he ruled, feeling for the first time in years that some piece of himself remained missing, somewhere out there among the trees, waiting to be found. It was during the afternoon council meeting that the first true trouble began to surface. Ronan sat at the head of the long table, forcing his attention onto matters of trade and territory disputes, while several of his advisors exchanged glances that told him rumors of the previous night had already begun spreading faster than Edmund could contain them. Damian Cole, a broad-shouldered noble from a rival bloodline who had long resented serving beneath Ronan's family, was the first to speak the words no one else dared voice directly. "Forgive my bluntness, Your Majesty," Damian said, his tone polite on the surface, but carrying an edge sharp enough to cut. "But there are whispers this morning that the king's control slipped last night, that his beast ran wild through the territory, uncontained, for the better part of an evening. Surely such rumors are false." The room went quiet, every advisor's attention shifting toward Ronan, waiting to see how he would answer. He kept his expression calm, revealing nothing of the fury that simmered beneath the surface at Damian's obvious attempt to plant doubt among the council. "The rumors are exaggerated," Ronan said evenly. "I was affected by a tainted drink during the dinner 2 nights prior. The effects have passed. There is nothing further to discuss." "Of course, Your Majesty," Damian said, inclining his head in a show of respect that did not quite reach his eyes. "Though I do wonder who might have wished to taint your drink in the first place. It would be troubling indeed if such an act came from within these very walls." The implication hung heavy in the room, an accusation, dressed carefully enough to avoid direct blame, while still planting the seed of suspicion. Ronan met Damian's gaze steadily, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a visible reaction. "When I find who is responsible," Ronan said, his voice low, and carrying the quiet authority that had kept his enemies wary for years. They will answer for it personally. Until then, I trust my counsel to focus on matters that actually require our attention today. The meeting continued, but the tension in the room did not fully fade, and Ronan felt the weight of unseen eyes watching him more closely than usual, searching for any further sign of weakness they might use against him. He wondered, not for the first time, whether the poison in his drink had been meant only to embarrass him, or whether it had been the opening move in something far more dangerous. Later that evening, Edmund returned to Ronan's private chambers with news that only deepened the mystery, rather than solving it. "I spoke with several of the lower pack leaders, near the southern border, Your Majesty," he said. "None of them reported a missing woman, though one mentioned unrest within the Marsh Pack last night. Apparently a young Omega defied the Alpha's son, and fled into the forest during the storm. She has not returned home since." Ronan's attention sharpened instantly. "The Marsh Pack. Do you have a name?" Edmund hesitated, clearly uncertain whether the information was truly connected to the king's request, or simply an unrelated coincidence. "Nora Bennett, Your Majesty. A healer within the pack, well regarded among the villagers though poorly treated by the pack's leadership, from what I gathered." The name settled into Ronan's chest with a strange, quiet certainty, though he had no way yet to prove it belonged to the woman from the valley. Still, something about it felt right, in a way he could not explain. The same instinctive pull that had guided his beast to bow before a stranger in the mud. "Bring her to the palace," Ronan said, quietly. "Under whatever reasonable pretense you can arrange. I don't want the Marsh Pack, or anyone else, to understand why she truly matters. Not until I understand it myself." Edmund studied him for a long moment before nodding. "As you wish, Your Majesty. Though I should warn you, if she is connected to what happened last night, keeping this quiet may prove more difficult than you expect. Rumors have a way of finding the truth eventually." Ronan turned back toward the window, staring out over the darkening kingdom, thinking of golden lantern light reflected in gentle eyes, of a voice that had reached through madness itself to bring him back. Whatever difficulties lay ahead, he was already certain of one thing: he needed to see her again, and nothing short of the kingdom itself would keep him from finding a way. Far to the south, in a small cramped room within the Marsh Pack's lower village, Nora sat awake long after the rest of the household had gone to sleep, staring at her hands in the dim candlelight, still able to feel the warmth of matted fur beneath her fingers, still able to hear the low, broken sound the great wolf had made before he bowed his massive head against her knees. She did not know who he was. She only knew that something about that night had changed her in a way she could not yet name, and that some quiet, persistent part of her heart already ached with the strange certainty that she would see him again. She had returned home just before dawn, slipping through the back entrance before anyone noticed her absence, and had spent the following day pretending nothing unusual had happened at all. Colin Marsh had been furious over the missing herbs, furious enough that his father, the Pack Alpha, had confined her to extra duties as punishment, scrubbing floors and tending animals from sunrise until well past dark. She endured it silently, as she always did, though tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, the punishment did not feel quite so heavy, because her mind kept drifting back to golden eyes and a voice rough with exhaustion, asking her who she was. She had not answered him then. Some quiet instinct had told her that giving her name to a stranger, even one she had helped, even one whose gaze had made her chest feel strangely tight, might invite trouble she could not yet predict. Now, sitting alone in the dark, she wondered whether that instinct had been wisdom, or simply fear, and whether either choice would matter at all, once fate decided what came next. The summons arrived 3 days later, carried by a palace messenger dressed in fine gray and silver, a color combination that made every eye in the Marsh village turn toward the small cottage where Nora lived with her aunt. The messenger did not explain much, only that the palace required a healer familiar with rare herbs to assist with an urgent matter, and that Nora Bennett had been specifically recommended for the task. Nora stood frozen in the cottage doorway, the folded parchment trembling slightly in her hands, while her Aunt Margaret hovered nearby with wide, worried eyes. "The palace," Margaret whispered once the messenger had gone. "Why would the palace ask for you by name? You've never even been past the village borders." "I don't know," Nora said honestly, though a small, persistent voice in the back of her mind wondered whether this had anything to do with the night in the storm, with golden eyes, and a voice that still lingered in her thoughts more often than she wanted to admit. She dismissed the thought quickly. It seemed impossible that a wounded stranger in the mud could have any connection to a formal summons from the Alpha King's own palace. Colin Marsh was furious when he learned of the summons, his pride wounded that an overlooked Omega from his own pack had been requested by name, while he himself had never received such recognition. He tried, briefly, to insist that Nora could not be spared from her duties, but even he did not dare refuse a direct request bearing the royal seal. By the following morning, Nora found herself riding in a modest carriage toward the capital, her few belongings bundled in a worn cloth bag, her heart caught somewhere between fear and a curiosity she could not fully explain. The palace, when it finally came into view, took her breath away despite everything weighing on her mind. Towers of pale stone rose against the sky, draped in banners the color of dark storm clouds and silver moonlight, the sigil of the ruling bloodline stitched proudly across each one. Guards lined the outer gates, their postures sharp and disciplined, and Nora felt smaller than she ever had in her life as the carriage passed beneath the shadow of the palace walls. She was led inside by a quiet, efficient steward, who explained little beyond the basics of where she would be staying and what duties she might be expected to perform. Nora barely absorbed any of it, her attention consumed instead by the sheer scale of the palace around her. Marble floors polished to mirror brightness, tapestries depicting battles and legends she did not recognize, ceilings so high they seemed to disappear into shadow. She was given a small room near the healer's quarters, simple but far finer than anything she had known in the Marsh village, and told to rest before being called upon for her duties the following day. Nora sat on the edge of the narrow bed once she was finally alone, staring at her hands again, the same way she had every night since the storm, wondering what strange twist of fate had brought her here, and whether it had anything at all to do with the wolf she had calmed in the mud. She did not have to wait long to find out. The following morning, a different steward arrived to collect her, this one older and more solemn, explaining only that she had been requested for a private audience before beginning any formal healing duties. Nora's stomach twisted with nerves as she was led through corridor after corridor, deeper into the palace than she imagined any newly arrived healer would normally be taken, until finally they stopped before a set of tall wooden doors, carved with the same sigil she had seen on the banners outside. The steward knocked once, then opened the doors and gestured for her to enter, before quietly withdrawing, leaving her alone in a spacious private study, lined with books and warmed by a low fire, crackling in a wide stone hearth. A man stood near the window with his back to her, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dark, finely tailored clothing that spoke clearly of status and wealth. He turned as she entered, and the moment his eyes met hers, Nora felt the breath leave her body entirely. Golden eyes, the same golden eyes that had stared up at her from a massive wolf's face in the middle of a storm, the same eyes that had looked at her with such raw, unguarded vulnerability as he asked her who she was. Except now those eyes belonged not to a wounded beast in the mud, but to a man whose bearing and dress made his identity unmistakable even before the steward's earlier careful hints finally clicked into place inside her mind. "Hugh," Nora breathed, unable to stop the word from escaping before she could think better of it. Ronan's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession, surprise giving way to something like relief, and beneath that, something warmer still, that he seemed to be fighting hard to control. "Nora Bennett," he said quietly, testing the name against the memory of the woman who had knelt beside him in the mud. "I wondered if it would truly be you." "You're the king," Nora said, the realization settling over her with a weight that made her knees feel unsteady. "The Alpha King. I helped a wolf in the storm, and it was you the whole time." "Yes," Ronan admitted, taking a slow step closer, though he stopped himself at a respectful distance, clearly mindful of how overwhelming this discovery must feel for her. "I did not know how to find you again without revealing more than I was ready to explain. I'm sorry for the deception of the summons, though I promise you, your skill as a healer is genuine enough reason on its own for you to be here." Nora's mind raced, trying to piece together everything that had happened since the storm. The strange bow of the beast's massive head, the way her chest had ached with an inexplicable pull toward a stranger she had never expected to see again. "Why did you need to find me at all?" she asked carefully. "I only helped because you were hurt. I didn't expect anything in return." Ronan's jaw tightened slightly, and for a moment, he seemed to search for the right words, a man clearly unaccustomed to explaining things that touched on matters far more vulnerable than politics or war. "There are old stories among our kind," he said finally, "about bonds that reach deeper than choice, deeper than reason. My beast has never bowed to anyone before that night, not to my father when he ruled before me, not to any noble presented as a potential match over the years. It bowed to you, a stranger it had never met, within moments of you touching it." Nora's heart pounded as the meaning behind his words settled over her slowly, cautiously, as if accepting it too quickly might shatter something too fragile to hold. "You're saying I'm your—" She could not quite finish the sentence, the word feeling too large and too strange to speak aloud in a room this grand, standing before a king whose eyes watched her with such careful, restrained intensity. "I'm saying I don't fully understand it myself," Ronan admitted, "but I could not simply let you walk away and pretend that night meant nothing. My beast has not settled since. It grows restless, and I believe, though I cannot yet prove it, that your presence is the only thing capable of calming it fully." Nora studied him for a long moment, this powerful, controlled man, now standing before her looking, for the first time since she had entered the room, genuinely uncertain. She thought of the Marsh Pack, of years spent being overlooked and undervalued, treated as lesser simply for the misfortune of being born an Omega. She thought of the quiet ache that had lingered in her chest every night since the storm, an ache she had told herself was simply curiosity, nothing more. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, unsure whether she was asking about her own fate, or his, or something far larger than either of them alone. "Now," Ronan said, his voice softening in a way that felt entirely unguarded, "I would like the chance to know you properly. Not as the woman who calmed a beast in the mud, but as Nora Bennett, the healer whose voice reached me when nothing else could. If you're willing to stay, I will ensure you are treated with every respect this palace can offer, regardless of what comes of any bond between us." Nora hesitated, weighing the strange, frightening enormity of everything unfolding around her against the quiet certainty that had settled somewhere deep in her chest since the moment she had first touched his fur in the mud. Whatever this was, whatever it might become, some part of her already understood that walking away now was no longer truly a choice she was capable of making. "I'll stay," she said finally, and watched something in Ronan's carefully controlled expression ease, just slightly, like tension released after being held too long. Neither of them could have known, standing together in that quiet, firelit study, how quickly the fragile peace of that moment would be tested. Outside those tall wooden doors, whispers already moved through the palace like smoke through cracks in old stone, carried by servants who had noticed the king's private summons, by nobles who resented any threat to their carefully arranged futures, and by at least one man, Damian Cole, who watched every development within the palace with the patient, calculating eyes of someone already planning how best to turn a king's vulnerability into his own advantage. News of the king's private meeting with a healer from a minor pack spread through the palace faster than Ronan had hoped it would contain. By the time the sun set on Nora's first full day within the palace walls, whispers had already reached every corner of the servant quarters, and, more troublingly, the ears of several council members, who saw opportunity in any weakness they could uncover. Vivian Marsh, cousin to Colin and daughter of a noble family long positioned as favorites for a future royal match, arrived at the palace only 2 days later, summoned by her own family, the moment word reached them, of a healer capturing the king's private attention. Vivian was beautiful in the sharp, practiced way of someone raised to understand exactly how her appearance and manner could be used as tools, and she wasted no time making her presence known throughout the palace halls. Nora first encountered her in the healer's garden, a quiet space tucked behind the eastern wing, where rare herbs grew in careful rows, tended by healers who valued silence over conversation. Nora had come there, seeking a few moments of peace, still overwhelmed by everything unfolding around her, when Vivian's voice cut smoothly through the quiet. "You must be the healer everyone's been discussing," Vivian said, stepping between 2 rows of lavender, with the easy grace of someone who belonged wherever she chose to stand. "Nora, isn't it? From the Marsh Pack, I believe. How interesting that my own family's pack produced someone capable of catching the king's attention so completely." Nora straightened, sensing immediately the careful edge hidden beneath Vivian's polite tone. "I'm simply here to help with healing duties," she said carefully. I'm not sure what else there is to discuss. Vivian's smile did not waver, though something colder flickered briefly behind her eyes. Of course. Though I imagine you understand how unusual it is for the king to summon anyone so directly, let alone request a private audience before any healing duties even began. Rumors do travel quickly within these walls. I don't put much stock in rumors, Nora replied evenly, though her pulse quickened with a discomfort she tried hard not to show. Wise, Vivian said, tilting her head slightly, studying Nora with an intensity that felt more like measurement than genuine curiosity. Then you'll understand when I say, simply as a friendly warning, that positions within a royal court can be far more precarious than they appear, especially for those without proper family standing to protect them. The warning hung in the air between them, unmistakable despite its polite wrapping, and Nora felt the full weight of what she had stepped into settle heavier across her shoulders. She was not simply navigating a strange new bond with a king whose beast had bowed before her. She was now also navigating the currents of a court built on old bloodlines and careful arrangements, currents that clearly had no patience for an overlooked Omega suddenly rising into unexpected significance. Vivian left the garden without waiting for a response, her departure as smooth and controlled as her arrival had been, and Nora stood alone among the lavender for a long while afterward, her earlier sense of peace thoroughly shattered. That evening, Ronan found her still troubled during their agreed meeting in his private study, a routine they had settled into over the past 2 days, spending quiet hours simply talking, learning small details about each other's lives that neither had shared with anyone else in years. He noticed her distraction immediately. Something's bothering you, he said, setting aside the reports he had been reviewing to give her his full attention. Nora hesitated, unsure how much to share, wary of causing conflict between him and families whose support he likely needed to maintain peace within his kingdom. Eventually, though, she decided honesty served them both better than silence. I met Vivian Marsh today, she said. She made it clear that my position here is unwelcome to certain families with expectations of their own. Ronan's expression darkened, though his voice remained carefully controlled. Vivian's family has long assumed a future match between us, an arrangement pursued more by her father's ambition than by any genuine wish of mine. I never encouraged such expectations, though I understand how her family's disappointment might express itself as hostility toward you. She's not entirely wrong to be concerned, Nora said quietly. I have no noble blood, no family standing, nothing that would traditionally make me suitable for a place at your side. I understand why my presence here creates difficulty. Ronan rose from his seat and crossed the room, to sit beside her instead of across the desk that usually separated them during their conversations, an act that felt deliberately intimate, in a way that made Nora's heart beat faster. Suitability, measured by bloodline and arrangement, has never once accounted for what actually happened between us, he said. My beast did not care about noble blood when it bowed before you in the mud. It recognized something far older and far more honest than any political arrangement could ever produce. That may be true, Nora said, but your kingdom still runs on those old rules, doesn't it? Nobles like Vivian's family, and men like Damien Cole, from what I've overheard, they won't simply accept an Omega from a minor pack standing beside their king, regardless of what your beast recognized in the mud. Ronan's jaw tightened at the mention of Damien's name, and Nora could see clearly that the tension within the council ran deeper than simple disapproval of her presence. Damien has wanted my throne for years, Ronan admitted. He comes from a bloodline that once rivaled mine for leadership generations ago, and he has never fully accepted losing that claim. Any weakness he perceives, including whatever bond exists between us, becomes a tool for him to use. The admission settled uneasily between them, and Nora realized with growing clarity that whatever connection had drawn them together in that storm now carried consequences far beyond either of their private feelings. She was no longer simply a healer who had helped a wounded stranger. She had become, whether she wished it or not, a piece within a much larger and more dangerous game. I don't regret helping you, she said finally, meeting his eyes steadily despite the uncertainty coiling tighter in her chest. Whatever happens because of it, I don't regret that night. Something in Ronan's expression softened at her words. The careful control he maintained during council meetings and public appearances, slipping away entirely in this quiet, private moment. Neither do I, he said softly, though I intend to ensure you never face the consequences of that night alone. Whatever difficulties Vivian, Damien, or anyone else within this court chooses to create, you have my protection, Nora. That is not a promise I offer lightly. Nora wanted desperately to believe him completely, wanted to let herself sink fully into the warmth building steadily between them since that first quiet meeting in his study. But some cautious part of her, shaped by years of being overlooked and undervalued within her own pack, held back a small, protective distance, unwilling yet to trust fully that a king's promise would prove strong enough to withstand whatever storms still waited ahead. Over the following days, Nora settled slowly into palace life, splitting her time between healing duties and quiet evenings spent with Ronan, their bond deepening with each conversation, each small shared laugh, each moment where the careful walls both of them had built around their hearts lowered just slightly further. She learned that Ronan carried burdens far heavier than most within the palace ever glimpsed, the weight of ruling a kingdom that constantly tested his control, the loneliness of a position that demanded strength without ever allowing genuine vulnerability. In turn, Ronan learned of Nora's years within the Marsh Pack, the quiet cruelty of being treated as lesser simply for her Omega status, the resilience she had built through years of caring for others despite receiving so little care in return. Each shared story wove another thread between them, strengthening a connection that had begun in mud and storm but was slowly growing into something neither of them had expected to find. Yet even as their bond deepened, the tension within the palace grew alongside it. Vivian's family pressed harder for reassurance regarding a future match, their disappointment curdling steadily into open resentment. Damien Cole grew bolder in council meetings, questioning Ronan's judgment more frequently, planting doubts among other nobles about whether a king so easily distracted by a common healer remained fit to lead a kingdom that depended on strength and unwavering control. Nora felt the weight of those tensions pressing closer each day, a storm building slowly on the horizon, far different from the one that had first brought her and Ronan together, but no less dangerous for its quiet, patient approach. She did not yet know how far Damien's ambition would push him, nor how quickly the fragile peace surrounding her growing bond with the king would shatter completely. She only knew, with a certainty that settled deep and unshakable within her chest, that whatever storm came next, she no longer wished to face it without Ronan standing beside her. 3 weeks after Nora's arrival at the palace, Ronan made a decision that sent shockwaves through the entire court. During a formal council gathering, with every major noble family represented, and Damien Cole seated near the head of the table with his usual calculated calm, Ronan announced that Nora Bennett would be assigned as his personal healer, granting her permanent residence within the royal wing and access to matters typically reserved only for trusted advisors and family. The announcement landed like a struck bell throughout the room, silence stretching taut before a wave of murmured reactions rippled around the table. Vivian's father rose halfway from his seat before catching himself, his face flushed with barely restrained anger. Damien, by contrast, remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable, though Nora, watching from a respectful distance near the doorway where Ronan had asked her to stand, felt a chill crawl down her spine at the calculating stillness in his gaze. "Your Majesty," Damien said, once the murmurs quieted enough for his voice to carry clearly. "Surely, such a significant appointment deserves more careful consideration. A personal healer, granted access equal to trusted council members, is no small matter, particularly when the healer in question comes from such modest origins." "Nora Bennett's skill and character have earned this position," Ronan replied evenly, though the warning beneath his calm tone was unmistakable to anyone paying close attention. "I do not require the council's approval for decisions regarding my personal household staff." "Of course not, Your Majesty," Damien said, inclining his head with practiced deference that did nothing to hide the sharpness in his eyes. "Though I do wonder whether this appointment reflects genuine confidence in her skill, or something rather more personal in nature. The kingdom has grown accustomed to a king whose judgment remains clear and unclouded. It would be troubling indeed if that clarity became compromised." The implication landed exactly as Damien intended. A public challenge disguised carefully enough to avoid outright disrespect, while still planting seeds of doubt among every noble present. Ronan's expression hardened, and for a brief, tense moment, Nora feared the confrontation might escalate beyond words. Instead, Ronan simply held Damien's gaze steadily until the other man looked away first, a small but unmistakable assertion of authority that settled the room back into uneasy quiet. The meeting concluded shortly after, though the tension it created did not dissipate nearly so easily. Over the following days, Nora noticed subtle shifts throughout the palace. Servants who once greeted her warmly, now offering careful, measured politeness instead. Nobles who avoided her gaze entirely in hallways where they once might have offered polite conversation. The court, it seemed, had begun quietly choosing sides, and not entirely in her favor. Despite the growing tension, her bond with Ronan continued deepening, in ways that felt entirely separate from the political storm building around them. Late one evening, several days after the council meeting, Ronan found her in the healer's garden long after most of the palace had gone quiet for the night, tending to a bed of night-blooming flowers that only opened once darkness fully settled. "You should be resting," he said softly, settling beside her on the low stone bench that overlooked the garden's careful rows. "I could say the same to you," Nora replied, offering him a small smile despite the exhaustion evident in the tired lines around her eyes. "Ruling a kingdom seems to leave little room for rest, from what I've observed." Ronan chuckled quietly, a rare sound that Nora had come to treasure more than she wanted to admit, given how carefully he guarded such moments of genuine ease. "Perhaps we're both in need of rest. We rarely allow ourselves," he said. "Though I find myself less troubled by exhaustion tonight, given the company." Nora felt warmth rise in her cheeks despite the cool night air, and for a while, neither of them spoke, simply sitting together in comfortable silence, beneath the pale glow of moonlight filtering through the garden's careful rows. It was in moments like these, quiet and unguarded, that Nora felt most certain the bond between them carried a weight far beyond simple obligation or old legend, something that had grown steadily into genuine affection she had never expected to find, least of all within a place as complicated and dangerous as this palace had proven to be. "I worry about what Damien intends," she admitted eventually, breaking the comfortable silence with a concern that had weighed on her mind since the council meeting. He seemed almost satisfied by the tension his words created, as though it served some larger purpose beyond simply expressing disapproval. Ronan's expression grew more serious, the ease of moments before replaced by careful consideration. "Damien has spent years positioning himself for greater influence within this kingdom. My father dismissed his ambitions as harmless posturing, but I've never fully trusted that assessment. The poison that affected me during that council dinner weeks ago, I believe now more than ever that Damien was responsible, though I have yet to find proof strong enough to act against him directly." "If he was willing to poison you once," Nora said carefully, "what's stopping him from trying again, especially if he sees our bond as a threat to whatever plans he's building?" Ronan's jaw tightened, a flicker of genuine concern crossing his features before he carefully smoothed it away again. "I've increased security around both of us since the council meeting, though I've tried not to alarm you unnecessarily. Edmund believes Damien is gathering support among certain nobles who share his resentment toward my family's rule, though how far that support extends remains unclear." The conversation left Nora with a heavier weight settled in her chest, the quiet peace of the garden now tinged with an undercurrent of danger she could not ignore. Still, sitting there beside Ronan beneath the moonlight, she found herself unwilling to let fear overshadow the genuine warmth growing steadily between them, choosing instead to focus on the present moment, rather than the uncertain dangers waiting somewhere ahead. Over the following weeks, Nora's role within the palace continued to shift and grow, her healing skills earning quiet respect, even among servants initially wary of her sudden rise in standing. She began accompanying Ronan to smaller gatherings, learning slowly how to navigate the careful, layered conversations that defined court life, growing more confident in her ability to hold her own among nobles who had once intimidated her simply through their bearing and bloodline. Yet even as her confidence grew, so too did the whispers surrounding her presence. Vivian's family, still smarting from Ronan's public appointment of Nora as his personal healer, began quietly aligning themselves more closely with Damien's growing faction, their shared resentment finding common cause in opposing what they viewed as an unsuitable rise in Nora's standing. Small acts of hostility became more frequent, cold glances in hallways, deliberately excluded invitations to minor gatherings, whispered comments meant to be overheard just enough to sting, without crossing into anything Nora could directly confront. Through it all, Ronan remained steadily protective, though Nora noticed the toll the growing tension took on him as well, the careful control he maintained during public appearances slipping more frequently into visible frustration during their private evenings together. His beast, too, seemed to sense the mounting pressure, restless in ways that worried Nora deeply. During the rare moments Ronan allowed her to witness the strain building beneath his controlled exterior. One evening, nearly a month after her arrival at the palace, Nora found him in his private study long past midnight, his hands braced against the edge of his desk, his breathing controlled but tight, the telltale signs of a man fighting hard against something threatening to break free from within. "Ronan," she said softly, closing the door quietly behind her, before crossing the room toward him. "I'm fine," he said through gritted teeth, though the strain in his voice told a different story entirely. "The council meeting today, Damien pushed harder than usual, questioning decisions I've made regarding border patrols, implying incompetence in front of nobles who seemed all too eager to nod along with his accusations. I nearly lost my temper entirely." Nora moved closer, placing a gentle hand against his tense shoulder, the same steady touch she had used weeks ago in the mud, to calm the wild fury raging inside him. Almost instantly, she felt the tension beneath her palm begin to ease, his breathing slowing gradually, as her presence worked its familiar, quiet magic. "You don't have to carry all of this control alone," she said softly. "Whatever Damien intends, whatever storm is building around us, you're not facing it by yourself anymore." Ronan turned to face her fully, his golden eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. The exhaustion and frustration of the day, slowly melting into something warmer, something that had been building steadily between them since that very first night in the storm. "I don't know what I would have done," he admitted quietly, "if that night in the mud had never happened. If you had simply walked away instead of staying." "I couldn't walk away," Nora said simply, honestly. "Something in me wouldn't let me." Ronan reached up slowly, brushing a strand of hair away from her face, with a tenderness that felt entirely at odds with the powerful, controlled king the rest of the kingdom knew. "I'm grateful for whatever stubborn instinct kept you there," he murmured, his hand lingering gently against her cheek. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the space between them charged with something neither had fully spoken aloud, though both understood clearly enough what it meant. It was Nora who finally closed the remaining distance, rising onto her toes to press a soft, tentative kiss against his lips, a question as much as a statement, uncertain, until the moment his arms wrapped gently around her, pulling her closer, answering with a certainty that left no room for doubt. Outside the private study, unseen by either of them, a shadow lingered briefly near the corridor's edge, before slipping quietly away into the darkened halls, carrying news that would soon reach ears far less sympathetic to the tender moment unfolding within, ears already plotting how best to use this growing bond as the final piece needed to set their carefully built plans into motion. The news reached Damien Cole within the hour, delivered quietly by a servant loyal to his cause who had witnessed the tender moment between the king and his healer through the study's partially open door. Damien received the information with the same calm, calculating expression he wore during council meetings, though behind that careful mask, satisfaction stirred at the confirmation of what he had long suspected. He met that same night with Vivian's father, Lord Marsh, in a private chamber far from prying ears, the two men united by shared resentment, though driven by very different motivations. Lord Marsh sought to protect his daughter's future standing, while Damien pursued a far larger ambition entirely, one that had simmered patiently for years beneath careful loyalty and practiced deference. "The king has made his feelings clear," Damien said, pouring 2 glasses of dark wine, as Lord Marsh paced restlessly near the chamber's single narrow window. "A public display of affection, with a healer of no standing, witnessed within his own private study. This confirms everything we suspected." "My daughter has been humiliated," Lord Marsh said bitterly, accepting the offered glass without truly seeing it. "Years of careful arrangement, generations of understanding between our families, discarded for some common healer who stumbled into the king's path by pure chance." "Chance," Damien repeated thoughtfully, settling into a chair near the small fire crackling in the chamber's modest hearth. "Or something more deliberate than either of us initially considered. The old bonding legends speak of fated connections capable of calming even the wildest beast. If such legends hold any truth, this healer represents more than simple infatuation. She represents a genuine threat to the natural order that has governed succession within this kingdom for generations." Lord Marsh's expression shifted from bitter resentment toward something closer to alarm. "You believe the bond is genuine, not simply the king's momentary distraction?" "I believe," Damien said carefully, "that whatever exists between them grows stronger by the day, and that the longer we wait to act, the more difficult separating them will become. The kingdom has never accepted an omega from a minor pack rising to stand beside its ruler. Such a match would fracture loyalty among the noble families who form the true foundation of this kingdom's strength." The two men spoke late into the night, weaving together a plan built on shared grievance and calculated ambition, each convincing the other that their cause served the kingdom's greater good, even as personal motivations tangled inseparably with genuine political concern. By the time Lord Marsh finally departed, pale and resolved, Damien remained alone by the dying fire, turning over the pieces of a plan that had been building for far longer than this single night's conversation suggested. The following weeks brought a shift in tactics from Damien's growing faction, subtler and more dangerous than the open hostility Nora had grown accustomed to navigating. Whispers began circulating throughout the lower packs, carefully seeded rumors suggesting that the king's judgment had grown compromised, that his attention to matters of state had weakened considerably since Nora's arrival, that border patrols had grown lax and trade negotiations mishandled, all subtly attributed to a king too distracted by personal affairs to properly attend his duties. None of the rumors held much truth, but truth mattered little once doubt had been successfully planted among people already inclined toward suspicion of change. Nora felt the shift in atmosphere throughout the kingdom during a rare outing beyond the palace walls, accompanying Ronan on a visit to a border village that had reported minor disputes requiring the king's personal attention. Villagers who once greeted their king with warm respect now offered guarded, uncertain welcomes instead, their eyes lingering on Nora with open curiosity that carried an undercurrent of suspicion she had not encountered so openly before. "They've heard the rumors," Nora said quietly, once they were alone again, within their traveling carriage, the village disappearing behind them as they made their way back toward the palace. "Rumors spread faster than truth ever manages to catch up," Ronan replied grimly, his hands clenched tightly against his knees. "Damien understands this well. He doesn't need proof of wrongdoing, only enough doubt to weaken confidence in my leadership. It's a strategy far more dangerous than open confrontation, precisely because it's so difficult to counter directly." Nora reached over, placing her hand gently over his clenched fist, feeling the tension slowly ease beneath her touch, the same calming effect that had first drawn them together, now serving as a quiet anchor amid the growing storm surrounding them both. "What can we do?" she asked. "Simply waiting for the rumors to fade doesn't seem like it will be enough." "No," Ronan agreed. "It won't be enough. Edmund has been working to trace the source of these rumors, and he believes they originate from within Damien's household, though proving direct involvement remains difficult. Without solid proof, any accusation I make against Damien will simply be dismissed as retaliation against a political rival, further fueling the very doubts he's trying to create." The carriage rode on in tense silence for a while, both of them lost in worried thought, until Nora finally spoke again, her voice carrying a quiet determination that had grown steadily since her arrival at the palace weeks before. "Then let me help prove it," she said. "I've spent my whole life being underestimated, overlooked, precisely because no one expected much from me. Perhaps that same underestimation could work in our favor now. No one within Damien's circle would suspect a simple healer of gathering information against them." Ronan's expression shifted with immediate concern. "That's dangerous, Nora. If Damien discovered you were working against him directly, there's no telling what he might do to protect his plans." "I'm already a target simply by standing beside you," Nora pointed out gently. "At least this way, I'm not simply waiting helplessly for whatever comes next. I'd rather actively protect what we've built together than sit idle while Damien works to tear it apart." Ronan studied her for a long moment, clearly torn between his instinct to protect her from further danger and his recognition that her offer came from genuine strength rather than naive courage. Eventually, reluctantly, he nodded. "If you're determined to help, we do this carefully, together with Edmund's guidance. I won't risk losing you to Damien's ambition, not after everything we've already overcome to reach this point." Over the following days, Nora began quietly cultivating relationships among the palace's servant staff, many of whom had grown to respect her genuine kindness during her weeks working within the healer's quarters. Servants noticed things nobles rarely bothered to consider significant, overheard conversations while cleaning chambers, noticed unusual visitors arriving late at night, remembered small details that, pieced together carefully, began forming a clearer picture of Damien's activities. It was through one such servant, a young woman named Ella who worked within the household staff assigned to Lord Marsh's private chambers, that Nora first learned of the late-night meetings between Damien and Lord Marsh. Meetings that had grown increasingly frequent since the night Nora and Ronan's private moment had first been witnessed and reported. "They meet almost every night now," Ella confided quietly, during one of Nora's regular visits to the healer's quarters, where the young servant had come seeking treatment for a minor injury sustained during her duties. "Always in the same private chamber, always dismissing the usual staff before their conversations begin. I only know because I was asked to deliver refreshments once before being quickly sent away again." "Did you notice anything else?" Nora asked carefully, mindful not to push too hard and risk frightening the young woman into silence. Ella hesitated, glancing nervously toward the healer quarters' closed door, before lowering her voice further. "There were maps," she whispered, "spread across the table, along with documents I couldn't read clearly before being ushered out. And I heard Lord Cole mention something about the southern border patrols, though I couldn't understand the full context." The mention of border patrols sent a chill through Nora's chest, remembering Ronan's earlier concern about rumors suggesting weakened security along the kingdom's borders. If Damien was somehow manipulating actual patrol assignments to create genuine vulnerabilities, the danger extended far beyond simple political maneuvering into something that threatened the kingdom's actual safety. She relayed the information to Ronan and Edmund that same evening, watching their expressions grow increasingly grave as the pieces of Damien's plan began forming a clearer, more dangerous picture. "If he's manipulating border security," Edmund said grimly, "he may be planning something far more drastic than simply undermining confidence in your leadership through rumor alone." "An uprising," Ronan said quietly, the weight of the realization settling heavily across his features. "Weakened borders would allow outside forces or dissatisfied pacts to move more freely, creating exactly the kind of chaos Damien could use to justify seizing greater control, perhaps even challenging my position outright, under the guise of restoring order." The realization hung heavy in the room, transforming what had begun as court gossip and personal rivalry into something far more dangerous, a threat that extended beyond Nora and Ronan's personal happiness into genuine danger for the entire kingdom. Nora felt the weight of responsibility settle more firmly across her shoulders, understanding now that whatever came next would test not only her bond with Ronan, but the very safety of everyone within the kingdom's borders. "We need proof," Ronan said finally, his voice hardening with the same quiet authority Nora had first glimpsed during that stormy night in the mud, the authority of a king, determined to protect what mattered most, regardless of the cost required to do so. "Real proof, strong enough to expose Damien's plans before he has the chance to set them fully into motion. Whatever it takes, we cannot allow him to succeed." Gathering solid proof against Damien proved far more difficult than any of them anticipated. Weeks passed with careful, cautious investigation, Edmund quietly questioning trusted contacts within the guard, Nora continuing her careful conversations with palace servants, each small piece of information adding to a picture that remained frustratingly incomplete. Damien, meanwhile, grew bolder in his public challenges during council meetings, his questions about Ronan's judgment sharper, his subtle accusations regarding the king's supposed distraction more pointed with each passing gathering. The breaking point arrived on a night neither Nora nor Ronan had properly prepared for, despite weeks spent anticipating some form of confrontation. It began quietly enough, a messenger arriving late in the evening bearing urgent news from the southern border, the very region Ella had overheard mentioned during Damien's private meetings with Lord Marsh. "Riders have crossed from beyond our territory," the messenger reported breathlessly, having ridden hard through the night to deliver the news. "A raiding party, larger than typical border skirmishes, moving through a section of the patrol route that should have been fully guarded. Several villages have already been struck before our forces could properly respond." Ronan's expression hardened instantly, the careful control he maintained during court appearances giving way to the sharp, decisive focus of a leader facing genuine crisis. "Which section of the border?" he demanded. "The southeastern route, Your Majesty. Patrol assignments there were recently reduced, following orders that came through the council's regular channels, though I understand now, those orders may not have carried your direct authorization." The confirmation landed exactly as Ronan and Edmund had feared. Proof at last that Damien had been manipulating official channels to weaken exactly the border section most vulnerable to outside threat, creating precisely the chaos needed to justify seizing greater control under the guise of addressing a security crisis he himself had engineered. Within the hour, the palace erupted into controlled chaos. Guards mobilizing to reinforce the southern border, council members summoned for an emergency meeting despite the late hour, the entire kingdom's careful peace suddenly thrown into genuine uncertainty. Nora found herself swept along in the urgency, her healing skills suddenly in high demand as reports of injured villagers began filtering back toward the palace, alongside the initial news of the attack. It was during the emergency council meeting, held in the tense early hours before dawn, that Damien made his boldest move yet. Standing before the assembled nobles, his expression carefully arranged into practiced concern, he addressed the crisis with words that carried far more calculated purpose than genuine worry. "This attack proves exactly what many of us have feared," Damien said, his voice carrying easily through the tense chamber. "Our king's attention has grown divided, his judgment compromised by personal matters that have no place influencing decisions of state. Innocent villagers have suffered because proper vigilance was not maintained where it mattered most. The patrol reductions were never authorized by me," Ronan said sharply, his restraint clearly straining under the weight of Damien's calculated accusation. "Someone within this very council manipulated those orders without my knowledge or approval." "A convenient claim," Damien replied smoothly, "though I wonder how the council can trust assurances from a king who has already demonstrated distraction, significant enough for such manipulation to occur unnoticed beneath his own authority. Perhaps it's time this council considered whether stronger leadership is required to properly protect this kingdom during such uncertain times." The implication landed like a physical blow, an open challenge to Ronan's authority delivered before the very council members whose support determined the stability of his rule. Several nobles exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncertain how to respond to such a direct assertion. The doubt Damien had spent weeks carefully cultivating now bearing exactly the fruit he had intended. Nora, standing near the chamber's edge where she had been summoned to report on the injured villagers' conditions, felt her heart pound with a mixture of fear and fury as she watched Damien's calculated performance unfold. This was precisely the moment he had been building toward, using a crisis of his own creation to publicly question Ronan's fitness to rule, positioning himself as the stronger, more reliable alternative in a moment of genuine kingdom-wide fear. Before Ronan could respond further, before the tension in the room could fully resolve into open confrontation, a commotion erupted near the chamber's entrance, guards rushing in with news that sent a fresh wave of alarm through the assembled council. The raiding party, rather than retreating after their initial strike, had pushed further into kingdom territory, moving with unusual coordination that suggested far more organization than typical opportunistic raids ever displayed. "They're moving toward the capital," the guard captain reported urgently. "Their numbers are larger than initial reports suggested, and their route seems deliberately chosen to avoid remaining patrol strongholds." The news sent the council chamber into fresh chaos, fear rippling visibly through nobles who had grown complacent during years of relative peace within the kingdom's borders. Ronan rose from his seat, his presence commanding immediate attention despite the mounting crisis and Damien's earlier challenge to his authority. "Every available guard mobilizes immediately," Ronan ordered, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a leader who, whatever doubts Damien had tried to plant, still commanded genuine respect from those who served beneath him, directly. "Edmund, coordinate our defense along the most direct approach to the capital. I will lead the front line personally." "Your Majesty," one of the older council members interjected nervously, "given the concerns raised tonight regarding your focus, perhaps it would be wiser to remain within the palace, while others coordinate the defense." Ronan's gaze swept the room, settling briefly on Damien, before returning to address the full council with unwavering intensity. "This kingdom has faced threats before, and I have never once hidden behind palace walls, while others faced danger in my place. Whatever doubts certain members of this council wish to entertain regarding my fitness to rule, I intend to prove them wrong tonight through action rather than words." The chamber fell silent as Ronan strode from the room, guards falling into step behind him, the weight of the crisis now fully transforming from political maneuvering into genuine, immediate danger. Nora watched him go, her heart caught somewhere between fear for his safety and fierce pride at the unwavering strength he displayed even amid Damien's calculated attempt to undermine him. She did not remain behind in the palace as many might have expected. Instead, gathering her healing supplies quickly, she followed the mobilizing guards toward the palace's outer courtyard, determined to be of use wherever the coming battle required healing hands, regardless of the danger such proximity to the front line might carry. Edmund found her there, securing supplies onto one of the guards' transport wagons, his expression torn between concern for her safety and understanding of her determination. "This isn't a place for a healer without combat training," he said carefully. "The danger tonight extends far beyond typical border skirmishes. Injured people will need help regardless of where the fighting takes place," Nora replied firmly, continuing her preparations without pause. "I won't sit safely within the palace while others risk their lives, including Ronan, without doing everything within my power to help however I can." Edmund studied her for a long moment, clearly recognizing the same stubborn determination that had first drawn Ronan's attention during that stormy night weeks ago. "Stay close to the healing tents once we reach the battle line," he said finally, recognizing further argument would prove useless against her resolve. "And Nora, whatever happens tonight, know that Ronan would want you safe above all else." "I know," Nora said softly, meeting Edmund's concerned gaze steadily. "But safety has never been something either of us has been able to fully choose. Not since that night in the storm. I intend to face whatever comes tonight, standing as close to him as this healing work allows." As dawn broke gray and uncertain over the kingdom, guards, healers, and the king himself moved together toward the approaching threat, each carrying the weight of a crisis that had grown far beyond simple border skirmish into something that threatened the very stability of the throne itself. Nora rode among the healing wagons, her heart pounding with fear and determination in equal measure, unaware that the coming battle would test not only Ronan's strength as a warrior, but the true depth of the bond that had first been forged in mud and storm weeks before, a bond now facing its greatest trial yet. The battlefield stretched across a wide open plain just beyond the kingdom's outer villages, close enough to the capital that the smoke from burning fields could be seen rising against the pale morning sky. By the time Ronan and his forces arrived, the raiding party had already grown bolder, their coordinated movements confirming what everyone had feared, that this was no simple opportunistic raid, but a deliberately organized assault, timed precisely to strike during a moment of political vulnerability within the kingdom's own leadership. Nora watched from the relative safety of the healing tents, set up a careful distance behind the main line of guards, her hands already busy treating the first wave of wounded soldiers brought back from initial skirmishes. The sounds of battle carried clearly across the plain, shouts, and the clash of weapons mixing with the occasional roar of shifted wolves entering the fight in their more powerful forms. She caught glimpses of Ronan throughout the morning, his massive wolf form moving with fierce, controlled precision through the chaos, nothing like the wild, uncontrolled fury she had first encountered in the mud weeks ago. This was strength wielded with purpose, discipline honed through years of leadership, and watching him fight to protect his kingdom filled her with a fierce pride that momentarily overshadowed her fear. That fragile confidence shattered as the battle wore into its third hour, when a runner arrived at the healing tents with grim news that sent ice through Nora's veins. "The king has taken a wound," the young guard reported breathlessly. "Poisoned blade, similar to what affected him during the council dinner weeks ago. His control is slipping." Nora's blood ran cold. If Ronan's beast lost control on an active battlefield, surrounded by enemies and allies alike, the consequences could prove catastrophic, indistinguishable friend from foe, a repeat of that first terrible night in the storm, except now with far higher stakes, and no quiet, isolated valley to contain the danger. "Take me to him," Nora said immediately, already gathering emergency supplies without waiting for permission. "It's too dangerous," the guard protested. "The fighting is heaviest near his position." "He needs help only I can provide," Nora insisted, her voice carrying a determination that brooked no further argument. "If his control breaks completely, more people will die than if I simply try to reach him now." The guard, recognizing the truth in her words despite his reservations, agreed to escort her as close to the fighting as safety would reasonably allow. They moved quickly across the chaotic battlefield, Nora's heart pounding with every step, the sounds of combat growing louder and more immediate as they approached the section where Ronan had last been seen. She found him at the edge of a small grove of trees, his massive wolf form crouched low, his movements growing increasingly erratic as the poison worked through his system. Guards had formed a protective circle around him, clearly struggling to balance defending their position from continued enemy assault, while also managing the growing danger of their king's deteriorating control. "Nora, stay back!" Edmund shouted upon seeing her approach, his own sword drawn as he helped hold the defensive line. "His beast is close to breaking free entirely. It's not safe." Nora did not stop. She had faced this same danger once before in the mud, and though the stakes now carried far greater weight, the same instinct that had guided her that first night pulled her forward now, past the protective circle of guards, toward the massive, thrashing form of the wolf she loved. Ronan's eyes, when they finally focused on her, held the same wild, unseeing quality she remembered from that stormy valley weeks ago. Fury and pain tangled together, with no clear thought guiding either. His massive jaws snapped at the air, at shadows only he could see, his wounded control slipping further with every passing moment, despite the guard's best efforts to hold him steady. "Ronan," Nora said, her voice cutting through the chaos of battle with the same steady calm she had used that first night, though her heart pounded fiercely with fear for both his life and her own. "I know you're in there. I know this pain is trying to take you, but I need you to hear me." The wild wolf's head snapped toward her voice, recognition flickering faintly beneath the storm of confusion and pain clouding his golden eyes. Around them, the battle continued to rage, guards fighting desperately to hold the enemy advance, while simultaneously protecting their vulnerable king, the danger mounting with every passing second that his control remained uncertain. Nora stepped closer, ignoring the guards' alarmed protests, closing the distance between herself and the massive, dangerous form of the man she had come to love so completely over these past weeks. "You bowed to me once," she said softly, reaching out despite the very real danger of his current state. "You chose to trust me then, when everything in you was fighting to break free. I need you to trust me again now." Her hand touched his fur, matted now with sweat and blood from the ongoing battle, rather than mud and rain, but the effect proved just as powerful as it had that first stormy night. The wild thrashing beneath her palm began to still, gradually, his ragged breathing slowing, as the fog of poison and fury that had clouded his mind began, ever so slowly, to clear. "That's it," Nora murmured, keeping her voice steady, despite the chaos surrounding them both, despite the very real danger, still present on every side. "Stay with me. The kingdom needs you. I need you." Ronan's massive form shuddered beneath her touch, a low, pained sound escaping his throat that carried none of the earlier wild fury, only exhaustion, and the fading edges of pain slowly loosening its grip. His golden eyes, clearing further with each passing moment, remained fixed on her with an intensity that spoke of recognition returning fully, the man beneath the beast finding his way back through her steady, unwavering presence. The guards around them, watching in stunned amazement, slowly lowered their defensive stances as it became clear that whatever danger the king's failing control had threatened, Nora's presence had successfully averted it entirely. Even amid the chaos of ongoing battle, several soldiers paused briefly to witness the remarkable sight of their king's fiercest form, settling into calm submission beneath a healer's gentle touch. "The poison," Edmund said urgently, breaking through the momentary awe to address the practical crisis, still requiring immediate attention. "Nora, can you counter its effects? We need him at full strength if we're going to properly repel this assault." Nora nodded, already reaching for the emergency supplies she had brought, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. She had prepared for exactly this possibility since first learning of the poison used against Ronan weeks earlier, carrying antidotes crafted from her own careful study of rare herbs known to counter such toxins. Working quickly, she administered the antidote directly into the wound on Ronan's massive foreleg, the same leg that had first drawn her attention weeks ago in that muddy valley. The great wolf remained remarkably still throughout the process, his trust in her evident, despite the pain the treatment likely caused, his golden eyes never leaving her face, even as the antidote began working through his system. Within minutes, the last traces of wild confusion cleared entirely from Ronan's gaze. replaced by the sharp, focused awareness Nora had come to know so well during their weeks together within the palace. He rose to his full, imposing height, fully recovered, fully in control once more, and turned back toward the ongoing battle with renewed purpose and strength. "Stay here, where it's safer," he seemed to communicate through the pointed look he gave her, before rejoining the fight. Though Nora, watching him move back into the chaos with restored confidence and power, felt her heart swell with a fierce, protective love that made staying safely behind feel almost impossible, despite the very real danger still surrounding them. The battle turned decisively in the kingdom's favor. From that moment forward, Ronan's restored strength rallying the guards' flagging morale, his powerful presence once again commanding the field, with the same authority that had made him a respected leader, long before Nora had ever entered his life. Within another hour, the raiding party began retreating, their coordinated assault broken by the kingdom's renewed, unified defense. As the fighting finally quieted and the immediate danger passed, word spread quickly across the battlefield and back toward the capital of what had transpired. How the king's own healer, a woman with no noble blood or traditional standing, had calmed his failing control in the very midst of battle, saving not only his life, but likely preventing catastrophic losses among his own forces as well. It was a story that would travel far beyond the battlefield in the days that followed, reaching every corner of the kingdom and reshaping, in ways neither Nora nor Ronan could yet fully anticipate, the very foundation of how the court and the kingdom's people alike would come to view the remarkable bond between their king and the once overlooked Omega, who had proven herself capable of calming even his wildest, most dangerous storm. The kingdom's forces returned to the capital 3 days later, weary but victorious, carrying with them not only the relief of a threat successfully repelled, but also growing suspicion regarding how the raiding party had managed to breach the border so easily in the first place. Edmund had used the journey back to quietly gather additional testimony from captured raiders, several of whom, faced with the reality of their defeat, proved surprisingly willing to share information in exchange for leniency. What they revealed confirmed everything Ronan and Nora had already suspected, though the full scope of the betrayal still managed to shock even those who had anticipated Damien's involvement. The raiders had received detailed information about patrol schedules and border weaknesses from a source within the kingdom itself, information precise enough that only someone with genuine access to official council records could have provided it. Armed with this testimony, along with additional evidence Nora and Ella had carefully gathered over the preceding weeks, Ronan called for a full council session immediately upon returning to the palace, one where Damien Cole would finally face the consequences of his carefully constructed betrayal. The council chamber was fuller than Nora had ever seen it, word of the battlefield's dramatic events having spread widely enough that every noble family within reasonable distance had sent representatives eager to witness whatever confrontation awaited. Nora stood near Ronan's side as the session began, no longer relegated to the chamber's edges, but granted a position of clear significance beside the throne itself, a change in standing that had occurred so naturally following the battle that few among the assembled nobles thought to question it. 3 days ago, Ronan began, his voice carrying clearly through the tense, crowded chamber. This kingdom faced an assault along our southeastern border, one made possible only through the deliberate manipulation of official patrol assignments. I have since gathered testimony and evidence confirming the source of that manipulation, evidence I intend to share fully with this council today. Damien, seated near his usual position with practiced composure, showed no outward sign of alarm, though Nora noticed the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested genuine concern beneath his carefully maintained calm. "I look forward to seeing this evidence, Your Majesty," he said smoothly. "Given the chaos of recent events, I imagine confusion regarding proper protocol may have contributed more to this unfortunate breach than any deliberate manipulation. Captured raiders have confirmed receiving detailed patrol information from a source within this council," Edmund said, stepping forward to address the chamber directly. "Information that matches precisely with unauthorized changes made to official patrol assignments over the past several weeks, changes traced back through official records to documents bearing your seal, Lord Cole." A murmur swept through the assembled nobles, the careful, calculated calm Damien had maintained, finally showing genuine cracks as attention shifted heavily in his direction. "Documents can be forged," Damien said, his voice slightly sharper now, defensive, in a way that betrayed more than his earlier smooth composure had allowed. This is clearly an attempt to shift blame for a security failure onto a convenient scapegoat, likely orchestrated by those seeking to distract from questions regarding the king's own judgment. There is also the matter of witnessed meetings, Nora said, stepping forward despite the surprised glances that followed her unexpected participation in what had traditionally been matters reserved for nobles and council members alone. Meetings between yourself and Lord Marsh, held privately over several weeks, during which maps and documents relating to border security were discussed at length. Lord Marsh, seated nearby, paled visibly at Nora's words, his earlier resolve clearly wavering under the weight of public scrutiny, now falling upon him as well. I had no knowledge of any plan to endanger the kingdom, he said quickly, his voice carrying a note of genuine panic. Whatever discussions took place, I believed we were simply addressing legitimate concerns regarding the king's judgment, nothing more. A convenient claim, Ronan said, echoing Damien's own earlier dismissive words with pointed irony, though I imagine this council will require more than simple denial to accept innocence in a matter of such grave consequence. The chamber fell into tense silence as the full weight of the unfolding revelation settled over the assembled nobles. Damien's careful composure finally shattered entirely, his expression twisting into something far more honest than the calculated calm he had maintained throughout weeks of careful political maneuvering. You would have led this kingdom into ruin regardless, Damien said, his voice rising with barely restrained fury as he addressed Ronan directly, abandoning any further pretense of innocence. Distracted by a common healer, weakened by whatever bond you claim exists between you, unfit to properly protect this kingdom's interests. I merely accelerated an inevitable reckoning, one that would expose your weakness before it cost the kingdom something far more valuable than a single border skirmish. You endangered innocent villagers, Ronan said, his voice carrying cold, controlled fury that silenced any remaining murmurs throughout the chamber entirely. You manipulated official channels, conspired with outside forces, and risked catastrophic loss of life, all to serve your own ambition, disguised as concern for this kingdom's welfare. That is not accelerating an inevitable reckoning, Damien. That is treason. The word landed heavily throughout the chamber, and Nora watched as the remaining color drained from Damien's face, the full reality of his exposed betrayal finally settling in completely. Guards moved forward at Ronan's signal, flanking Damien's position as the council chamber erupted into a fresh wave of shocked murmurs and urgent whispered conversations. Take him to the northern tower, Ronan ordered, his voice steady, despite the visible fury still simmering beneath his controlled exterior. He will remain there under guard until a formal tribunal can properly determine the full extent of his crimes and the appropriate consequences that must follow. As guards moved to escort Damien from the chamber, his earlier composure completely abandoned, he cast one final, venomous glance toward Nora, his expression carrying a bitterness that made her skin crawl despite the safety of Ronan's protective presence beside her. This isn't finished, he said quietly, though his voice carried clearly enough for those nearby to hear. The kingdom will never fully accept her, regardless of what happens to me. Old traditions run deeper than any single man's ambition. Perhaps, Ronan replied evenly, refusing to let Damien's parting words shake his composed authority. But traditions built on nothing more than bloodline and arrangement have already proven weaker than genuine loyalty and courage. Nora Bennett has demonstrated both, repeatedly, in ways that matter far more than any noble title ever could. Damien was led from the chamber without further response, his carefully constructed plans for power and influence collapsing entirely in the span of a single dramatic council session. Lord Marsh, recognizing the full weight of his own complicity, quietly requested permission to withdraw his family from court entirely, a request Ronan granted with cold, measured formality that made clear no further leniency would be extended toward those who had conspired against the kingdom's genuine welfare. As the council chamber slowly emptied following the dramatic session's conclusion, whispered conversations continued throughout the palace for days afterward, the full story of Damien's betrayal and Nora's crucial role in both saving Ronan's life during battle and gathering the evidence needed to expose the conspiracy spreading rapidly among nobles and servants alike. The narrative that had once painted Nora as an unsuitable distraction now began shifting, slowly but unmistakably, into something closer to genuine respect and admiration for a woman who had proven her worth through courage and loyalty, rather than mere bloodline alone. Yet even as the immediate danger passed, and Damien's conspiracy lay fully exposed. Nora understood that deeper challenges still remained ahead. Old traditions, as Damien had bitterly warned during his final moments before removal, ran deep within the kingdom's foundation, and however much respect she had earned through recent events, the question of whether an Omega from a minor pack could ever truly stand beside a king, as something more than simply his healer, remained far from fully settled within the hearts and minds of the kingdom's people. Weeks passed following Damien's removal from court, the kingdom slowly settling back into a steadier rhythm as the immediate danger of both the border assault and the exposed conspiracy faded gradually into memory. Ronan devoted careful attention to rebuilding trust among the noble families whose loyalty had wavered during Damien's calculated campaign of doubt, while Nora continued her healing duties with a renewed sense of purpose, her standing within the palace now carrying genuine respect earned through demonstrated courage rather than simply granted through royal favor. Still, whispers of old tradition lingered, quiet but persistent, among certain corners of the court. A formal royal match, many believed, required more than simply courage and loyalty. It required bloodline, careful arrangement, generations of noble standing that no amount of battlefield heroism could fully replace. Nora felt the weight of these lingering doubts most keenly during a private conversation with Edmund, held one quiet evening in the healer's garden where she had first encountered Vivian's sharp warning so many weeks before. The council remains divided, Edmund admitted honestly, having grown close enough to Nora over recent months to speak plainly regarding matters he might once have kept carefully guarded. Damien's conspiracy exposed his own treachery clearly enough, but the underlying question he raised, whether tradition should bend to accommodate a bond built outside noble arrangement, that question remains unresolved among many who still hold significant influence. "I never expected acceptance to come easily," Nora said, though a quiet weariness colored her words, the accumulated weight of months spent proving herself worthy of a place she had never sought, but could no longer imagine leaving behind. "I only hoped that demonstrating genuine loyalty and courage might eventually outweigh concerns rooted in nothing more than birth and circumstance. It has outweighed those concerns for many," Edmund assured her gently. "Perhaps not all, not yet, but more than you might realize. The soldiers who witnessed you calm the king's failing control on the battlefield speak of you with genuine reverence now. Even several council members who once aligned closely with Vivian's family have begun quietly reconsidering their earlier objections." Nora found some comfort in Edmund's words, though the deeper uncertainty regarding her future alongside Ronan remained unresolved as autumn settled fully over the kingdom, the palace gardens shifting into rich golds and deep reds that mirrored the quiet transformation occurring throughout the court itself. It was Ronan who finally addressed the lingering uncertainty directly, calling for a full gathering of the kingdom's noble families and common representatives alike, a formal assembly held within the palace's grand hall, larger and more significant than any council session that had preceded it. Word spread quickly regarding the assembly's purpose, speculation running rampant throughout the palace and beyond regarding what announcement might warrant such an unprecedented gathering. Nora stood beside Ronan as the grand hall filled steadily with representatives from every corner of the kingdom. Nobles and villagers alike gathered together beneath banners bearing the ruling bloodline's ancient sigil, the weight of the moment settling heavily across her shoulders, despite Ronan's steady, reassuring presence beside her. "Many of you have questioned," Ronan began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed, expectant hall, "whether tradition should determine who stands beside a king, or whether genuine bond and demonstrated loyalty might carry equal, or perhaps even greater, weight. I have spent recent months considering this question carefully, weighing the concerns raised by respected members of this court against the truth I have witnessed firsthand." He turned toward Nora then, his golden eyes carrying the same warmth and certainty she had first glimpsed weeks ago in his private study, the careful control of a ruling king, momentarily softened by something far more personal and unguarded. "Months ago, during a storm that nearly cost me everything, a stranger with no knowledge of my identity or standing found me lost and dangerous, consumed by poison and fury I could not control. She did not run, she did not hesitate. She offered calm and safety when nothing else could reach me, and my beast, the oldest and most honest part of myself, recognized in that moment something no arrangement or bloodline could ever manufacture. The hall remained utterly silent, every eye fixed on the unfolding scene as Ronan continued, his voice growing steadier and more certain with each passing word. Since that night, Nora Bennett has proven her worth, not through inherited standing, but through repeated acts of courage and loyalty that few among even our most celebrated warriors could match. She calmed my failing control in the midst of battle, saving countless lives alongside my own. She gathered evidence that exposed a conspiracy threatening this entire kingdom's stability. She has earned, through action rather than birth, a place beside this throne that I believe honors this kingdom's true strength far more genuinely than any traditional arrangement ever could. Ronan turned fully toward Nora then, lowering himself onto one knee before her, in full view of the assembled court, a gesture that sent an audible gasp rippling through the grand hall. "Nora Bennett," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite the weight of the moment, "will you stand beside me, not simply as my healer, but as my queen, bound not by arrangement or bloodline, but by a bond forged through storm and battle alike, a bond I believe with everything in me was always meant to be?" Nora felt tears gather in her eyes, the accumulated weight of months spent proving herself, of years spent being overlooked within her own pack, before that stormy night changed everything, finally releasing into something that felt entirely like relief and joy combined. "Yes," she said softly, then more firmly as her voice found its full strength. "Yes, I will stand beside you, Ronan, for as long as you'll have me." The grand hall erupted into a mixture of reactions, cheers rising from many among the gathered common representatives, whose own lives had been touched by stories of Nora's courage and kindness, while several nobles remained more measured in their response, old traditions clearly not fully abandoned, even in the face of such a public, heartfelt declaration. Yet as Nora looked out across the assembled crowd, she noticed something remarkable unfolding gradually throughout the hall. Nobles who had once aligned closely with Damien's faction, slowly beginning to nod, their expressions shifting from uncertain hesitation toward something closer to genuine acceptance. Vivian Marsh stood near the hall's edge, her expression carefully composed, despite the obvious disappointment still lingering beneath her practiced calm. Yet even she, after a long moment of visible internal struggle, offered a small, respectful nod toward Nora, an acknowledgement that, however reluctantly given, carried genuine significance within a court where old rivalries rarely faded so gracefully. In the months that followed, preparations began for a formal coronation, one that would mark not simply Nora's rise to queen, but a broader shift within the kingdom's understanding of what truly determined worthiness to stand beside its ruling king. Nora spent those months continuing her healing work alongside her new responsibilities, determined that her rise in standing would never separate her from the genuine compassion and care that had first drawn Ronan's beast to bow before her in that muddy valley months ago. The coronation itself took place on a clear, bright morning, the storm that had first brought Nora and Ronan together, now feeling distant and transformed, its violent chaos replaced by the steady, hopeful sunlight streaming through the grand hall's tall windows. Nora stood before the assembled kingdom, dressed in deep blue robes that matched the ruling bloodline's traditional colors, her heart steady, despite the enormity of the moment unfolding around her. As the crown settled upon her head, formally declaring her queen alongside Ronan's rule, a sound rose from somewhere within the gathered crowd, quiet at first, then spreading steadily throughout the hall. It was the sound of kneeling, nobles and commoners alike lowering themselves before their new queen, a gesture of respect that carried none of the reluctant hesitation Nora had feared might linger even after Ronan's public declaration months before. She looked out across the sea of bowed heads, remembering suddenly and vividly the moment months ago when a massive, wounded beast had lowered its head against her knees in the middle of a storm, an act of surrender and trust that had begun this entire remarkable journey. Now, standing before an entire kingdom kneeling in genuine respect and acceptance, Nora understood fully that the bond forged that stormy night had grown into something far larger and more significant than either of them could have imagined. A bond that had not simply changed her own life, but had reshaped the very foundation of how her kingdom understood true worth and genuine loyalty. Ronan reached for her hand as the kneeling crowd slowly rose again, his golden eyes carrying the same warmth and certainty that had first drawn her to stay beside him in the mud months ago, rather than fleeing as fear and instinct might otherwise have urged. "From storm to throne," he murmured softly, quietly enough that only she could hear. "I never could have imagined a journey quite like this one." "Neither could I," Nora admitted, squeezing his hand gently, her heart full with a happiness she had never dared imagine finding. Not during those long, difficult years within the marsh pack, not even during that first frightening night, when she had stepped into the mud to calm a beast she never expected to see again. "But I wouldn't trade a single moment of it, not even the most difficult parts, because every storm we faced together only made this moment, standing here beside you, feel that much more certain and true." Together, hand in hand, king and queen turned to face their kingdom, the golden morning light streaming warm and steady across a hall filled with genuine hope for the future, a future built not on old arrangements and rigid tradition, but on courage, loyalty, and a bond that had proven, time and again, strong enough to calm even the wildest storm.